Today, we're going to kick off part one of what's going to be a two-part episode where we'll talk about the current economic crisis that's going on in Turkey and the controversy surrounding President Erdoğan's comments about his interest rate policies. In today's part, we're going to set the stage by delving into how competing economic theories attempt to explain the situation that's going on in Turkey. And then in part two, we'll explore what happens when these economic theories clash with the reality of the situation on the ground. To start off, though, let's listen to a succinct summary provided by Deutsche Welle and their reporting on the current crisis. Let's have a listen.
Double-digit inflation and a crashing currency are turning the incomes and savings of millions of Turks to dust. The lira has lost 50% of its value against the dollar since the beginning of the year, more than almost any other currency. Discontent is growing. In recent weeks, demonstrators took to the streets in Istanbul and Ankara. They called for the government to resign. Many lay the blame for Turkey's currency crisis on President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Every time he pressures the country's central bank and calls for interest rate cuts, the lira plummets even further. Economists warn inflation is spiraling out of control, and Turkish consumers are the ones who literally have to pay the price. But President Erdoğan holds the unconventional view that lower interest rates fight inflation. And despite the lira crashing, shows no sign of changing his position.
What we're doing might be politically very risky, but it's the right plan for our country and our nation.
Come on. Don't bullshit me. Like, yeah, the economy slowed down, but, it's like telling someone, oh, you need to lose weight, but rather than them going on exercise and dieting, they chop off their legs. It's like, okay, yeah, you reduced the weight, but there's bigger problems there. Welcome to Come On, Don't Bullshit Me, where we peel away the messaging of talking heads to get to the crux of today's issues. So one of the things that they teach us at the academy during military strategic studies is the flow from the academic ivory tower, if you will, of theory, the doctrine, to the strategy, all the way down to tactics. And more specifically, how each of them evolves along that chain of events. And there's countless examples of this throughout military history, all the way from like Sun Tzu to modern day. But one of the big stories that stands out, particularly at the Air Force Academy, is obviously an Air Force general. And that was General Curtis Lemay, the father of the modern bomber force. And most people today know him as the father of the Berlin airlift, but there is a lot more to him than that. In the Air Force, he's considered the father of SAC, the father of Strategic Air Command, which was essentially the bomber mafia. There's this expression in the Air Force, like fighter pilots make movies, but bombers make history. And while World War II was going on, the theory of warfare, which was being constantly tested because, we're in the middle of a world war, was about how bombers should go and run their campaigns, right? So this is where the concept of strategic bombing came in, especially after the Battle of Britain, because the Germans, the Luftwaffe, pretty much destroyed all of the docks and the war-making capability of the Brits after France capitulated. And according to some reports, there was like candid interviews of Churchill after the fact. But basically, they were saying, like, okay, Britain was pretty much ready to capitulate and surrender to Germany right then and there because the Luftwaffe was so effective and just completely decimating British war-making capability. But then during that time, the Brits did a cursory bombing mission to Germany, And Hitler was obviously pissed off about this, like how dare the British could come and reach out and touch us and bomb Germany. So he switched his focus. He ordered the Luftwaffe to, instead of bombing all the factories and the dock, the British war make capability, he said, we're going to bomb London, the city, and bomb the civilians for their insolence of like how daring to bomb the fatherland or whatever, which actually allowed the British war make capability to recover. Because the Germans temporarily stopped bombing the factories, they were able to recover their war-make capability and they continued to fight, and obviously they didn't surrender. And then eventually, obviously, the United States came in and tipped the tide. And while this was going on, they're like, okay, well, now that the Germans decimated London, well, now it's payback time. So the Brits were like, okay, we got to go bomb the Germans, but we need to figure out how we're going to do this, because obviously it's a difficult thing to do. And they tried to bomb specific factories, ball bearing plants, because that's the rules of warfare. Okay, what the hell are ball bearings, right? But those are like key components, and bombing the ball bearing plants basically grounded the German war fighting machine to a halt, because ball bearings were essential components in motors and engines and whatnot. But the Brits realized that their bombs were ineffective, right? Because this obviously was before the days of GPS. So they were pretty much reliant on flying over a target, dropping the ball, and then letting Isaac Newton's laws of gravity do the work. And it wasn't really that effective, especially because they were trying to be high up, because the flat cannons and whatnot were a big threat to the bombers. Flat cannons are like AAA anti-aircraft guns. So to avoid or to minimize the damage from anti-aircraft guns, you would try to fly above the flat cannons so that you can get to the German factories. But of course, being that high up, then it's harder to hit your targets. So that really didn't work. So eventually they decided, okay, well, we're going to do nighttime bombing runs, because at night it would be harder to hit the bombers. And we're going to be like low to the ground. And basically, instead of targeting factories, we're going to put like a box, if you will, over a city or a town and just bomb the shit out of it, right? That's why most German cities are pretty modern architecture, because all the nice ancient architecture with the wooden facade construction, the old, from like Hofbräuhaus comics, those don't really exist. Except for, actually, there's another side story. There was this one town right on the Swiss border. I forget the name of the German town. But obviously Germany, they're like, once they realized this nighttime bombing was going on, they pretty much said, okay, everyone has to shut their lights off, right? But this one German town that was like right on the Swiss border, they actually left their lights on. And then the Allies thought, oh, well, this town has their lights on, so clearly they're not Germany, and like it's right on the Swiss border. It's like, oh, this must still be part of Switzerland. So they skipped that. And I forget the name of the town, but if you go there now today, you can actually see how Germany looked like, at least German towns look like pre-World War II, because they were like saved because they successfully outsmarted the Allies by saying, oh yeah, we're totally Switzerland. But anyway, so the Brits were basically, okay, we're going to make a square instead of bombing individual factories, and be based on the lighting of the towns, dump all your bombers into that square of the village and just bomb the shit out of it. Like, who cares if it's a factory or a civilian target? This is obviously the days before Geneva Conventions. So the Brits basically leveled entire towns. So the Brits would bomb at night. Fast forward 1942, America has entered the war. And now there's this big thing where, while the Europeans were fighting, the U.S. was obviously neutral, and we were doing our own thing, like testing and R&D. So we developed this thing called the Norton bomb sight. It was this really super accurate bomb sight where you can dial in your altitude and the wind speed. And then on the bombing ranges in the United States, even though you're like really high up, ridiculously high up, based on what would be considered the flat cannon ceiling, and even despite flying above that ceiling, with the Norton bomb sight, you were like super accurate with the delivery of the bombs. So the Brits were like, hey, US, we're glad that you're part of the war effort, but we've been bombing the Germans. We got like 2 years under our belt. We got a lot of experience. So this is what we're doing. We're bombing at night. And we recommend you do the same thing. And the US, being cocky Americans that we are, we just said, nah, screw it. We got this thing called a Norton bomb site. And the Brits were like, oh, what is it? Oh, no, it's classified. That's how, like, even though like we shared things like Enigma code, stuff like that, well, amongst each other and breaking cryptograms and whatnot, the Norton bomb site was so top secret that we didn't even share it with the Brits, the technology with the Brits. But we're like, yeah, we have this Norton bomb site. It's super accurate. And we're not going to do nighttime bombing. We're going to do daytime high altitude precision bombing. And we can do that because we have this bomb site. And there's this big argument back and forth between British air power theorists and American air power theorists on what's the more effective bombing strategy, low altitude nighttime or high altitude daytime precision bombing. Long story short, the Norton bomb site was shit. It didn't work, and we didn't really do that much damage because turns out American quote experience was bombing ranges out in Arizona or whatever, desert conditions, no one's attacking you, nothing. So we quickly realized that. Well, we didn't quickly realize. We didn't realize shit. Well, actually, we realized it, but we didn't accept it. Basically saying, no, high altitude daytime precision bombing. That's the way to do things, and we're going to do it. And then, post-mortem, we figured out that, we actually weren't as effective as we thought we were because the testing conditions on a bombing range are completely different than actual war over one of the most powerful modern empires of human civilization. Anyway, the other funny thing was that during this whole debate of whether nighttime or daytime was more effective, rather than one side convincing the other of when and how to actually bomb, because both parties couldn't come to an agreement, each party decided to do their own thing. So we basically took turns, like the Americans would bomb during the day, and then the Brits would bomb at night, and then the daytime would come and the Americans would keep going on and on. So like the Germans never actually got a chance to breathe because of our own infighting. We were like basically constantly bombing them around the clock. So it's kind of like that. Anyway, other than this being an interesting story, we took these lessons. Well, they weren't really lessons because as far as we as Americans were concerned, daytime precision bombing was totally the best thing. And with this Norton bomb site, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. So we're going to continue doing this. And we're going to upgrade our B-17s, the Flying Fortress, which was the main bombing aircraft. And if you remember the movie Memphis Belle, the plane that they were fighting in the Memphis Belle, that's the B-17. But anyway, so the new aircraft that they were building was B-29, which was the Super Fortress. And that one was this upgraded airplane, like the Enola Gay, the bomber that dropped the atomic bomb. That was a B-29 as well. But it was this super fancy aircraft where everything was computerized fire control system. So rather than having like 10 people like in the Memphis Belle, a crew of 10, essentially one person could control multiple guns on the bomber, on the aircraft. And the armor was up armored to a point where it's okay, the anti-aircraft nor the German fighters would be able to fire on it. So it was going to be even more effective than that. And then obviously it was going to be bigger and larger and more capable, so you can even put more bombs on it and what have you. So all around, this was the pinnacle of American aviation technology, was the B-29. But by the time we got to be able to field it, well, the Germans already essentially surrendered, or at least they were close to surrendering, so there was not really no need for the B-29. So all that effort was for naught. But obviously the Pacific War was still going on, so essentially all those assets were moved over to the Pacific and were used against the Japanese. And this is where Curtis Lemay, this really came about, his genius, because basically everyone, at least on the American side, were saying, yep, it's high altitude precision bombing. We've already verified it, even though it was completely, not true. But as far as they were concerned at the time, yeah, high altitude daylight precision bombing was the way to go. And that's what we're going to continue doing until Curtis Lemay came in and he was like, wait a second. I don't think we should do this. There's something to what the British were doing. And what he did was, rather than just listening to the theory, and this is what's important, he looked at what the actual situation was on the ground. Because, and this is the whole point of the military MSS, the military strategic studies class at the academy. It's not just knowing the theory. You have to understand why the theory came about. And in business schools, they say like all theories or all models are lies, but some of them are useful. So he basically looked at this and said, okay, why are we doing a high altitude precision bombing in Germany? Well, because, one, we wanted to get above the ceiling of the flat cannons. And then two, we got our Norton bomb site, so we can do precision bombing there. But more importantly, the German war fighting capabilities were pinpointed in these factories, right? So that was the point, to do high altitude bombing. But in Japan, obviously we didn't do really strategic bombing in Japan for a long time because our bombers physically couldn't reach the Japanese homeland. That's where in the middle of China, we had the bomber base out of Chengdu. But, obviously because back then Japan controlled pretty much the entire coastline of China, even any forces that we pre-positioned out in China were still really far away because the Asian continent is ridiculously huge. But this is where we had the island hopping campaign, where rather than fighting the Japanese, we just basically bypassed them until we got to a point where we conquered a couple of islands that were within bombing range of Japan. And that's when we could unleash on bombers and do massive damage. It's kind of like, you remember in The Last of the Mohicans, where the British and the French were fighting, and then the English were like, oh, we're going to lose, it doesn't matter. And then like Day-Lewis was like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, it's only a matter of time. As soon as they get their artillery within range of our fort, it's pretty much game over. So they tried to, sue for peace, and, they left, and a whole bunch of other stuff happened, including the awesome theme song, but whatever.
Might I inquire after the situation, sir, given that I've seen the French engineering from the ridge above?
The situation is his guns are bigger than mine, and he has more of them. They keep our heads down while his troops dig 30 yards of trench a day. When those trenches are 200 yards from the fort and within range, he'll bring in these 15-inch mortars, lob explosive rounds over our walls, and pound us to dust. Aye.
So once we got our bombers in range, Curtis Lemay, who was in charge of the 8th Air Force and responsible for this bombing of the mainland, he looked at it and said, okay, well, first off, with the jet stream and basically Japan on virtue of being an island, Japan was almost always cloudy. It wasn't clear skies like in Germany. So going high altitude necessitated going above the cloud line, which means obviously you can't really see what you're bombing at. So that's one big issue. But he also noticed that the Japanese war-making machine, if you will, wasn't concentrated in factories like with the Germans, but actually they farmed it out because it was a total mobilization of the population. Basically, the entire population, including the cities and towns, were also used for warfighting. So bombing specific targets for a precision bombing strike wasn't as effective in Japan as it would have been in Germany, because basically the Japanese that weren't in specific factories or whatnot, they would be at home or in their little towns or areas doing whatever it is that needs to be done for the war effort. So the entire cities were contributing to the war effort. So precision bombing really didn't make sense. And the other thing was, unlike in Germany, where most of the buildings were stone or metalwork, it was all wood and paper, right? So it was highly susceptible to fire. So Curtis Lemay said, okay, you know what? Even though daylight precision bombing worked in Germany, and that's what the theory says, even though technically it didn't work, but again, that's besides the point. At that time, everyone thought it worked. He said, okay, even though it worked, I'm not going to go do that because it doesn't make sense, because Japan is not Germany and the conditions in Japan don't apply to the conditions in Germany. So we got to change the theory. The theory was right for Germany, but when you apply it to Japan for a different area, it doesn't work. So what he said, okay, we're going to do a nighttime, low altitude firebombing. And that's where you had the whole firebombing of Tokyo and a whole bunch of other cities. And of course, it ultimately culminated with the atomic bomb, but that's a separate story which is obviously immaterial to Curtis LeMay's decisions. Actually, before this, his whole big genius, if you will, was still while he was commander of the 8th Air Force back in Germany, because his whole thing was that the fighters normally would accompany the bombers. So basically when the bombers would roll in through to where they were going to go bomb, because it was high altitude, the German radar could see them, right? Because of the curvature of the earth. It's much easier to see something up higher altitude than it is to see something close to the horizon. So there was plenty of warning. And because we're going high altitude, we'd have our fighter escorts. And when the Luftwaffe would come and try to shoot down the bombers, the fighters would fight. And you have all those bazillion different World War II films. Like that scene, that famous scene from Millennium Falcon in Star Wars, the original New Hope, where they're fighting the TIE fighters. And, like, Luke finally shoots down one of the TIE fighters. Like, I got one. And Han Solo's like, don't get cocky, kid, right? Because there's more.
Got him! I got him! Great, kid. Don't get cocky.
There's still 2 more of them out there.
Like, that was inspiration from all those old World War II movies, because that's kind of like how it was. It's basically, you had these guys, just like Han and Luke, and their little separate shooting laser pods. There's like 10 guys on B-17 on the bomber. Most of them, they would be in their different little gun pods shooting at the fighters, right, that were flying around. And Germans would try to shoot down the bombers, and then the fighters would try to protect the bombers, and yada, yada, yada. And obviously, if all the fighters were destroyed, or if they ran out of fuel or whatever, had to leave, obviously the bombers would be exposed, and the German fighters could pick off and destroy the bombers, right? That was the whole thing. But then Lemay, what he decided, okay, we're not going to have the fighters escort our bombers. What we're going to do, I'm going to send all my fighters ahead of the bombers, like, an hour or half hour ahead of them. And then the Luftwaffe, they're going to be alerted because they see on the radar all these Allied aircraft. So they're going to send all their fighters up. And even if our fighters aren't effective, because they're like half hour to an hour ahead of the bombers, because the bombers are in air, right? They're just behind the fighters. They're going to do their dogfight and everything like that. Hopefully our fighters will, basically destroy the fighters. But even if they don't, the German fighters will run out of fuel and they're going to have to be forced to land. So by the time the bombers actually come on station, there's not going to be any German fighters there. We either killed them, shot them all down, or they had to RTB, return to base. So, and that was a huge thing. And then, okay, I shouldn't be like completely praising him on this, because part of this was because with the invention of the P-51 Mustang, which was the brand new aircraft, that allowed him to do this tactic. But still, the fact that he even came up with this tactic and said, basically, I'm going to leave all my bombers exposed, which was back then was unthinkable, because bombers are your most important asset. He said, no, I'm going to leave them completely exposed, but I'm going to send this fighter screen ahead of them to basically bait the Luftwaffe. It was kind of ingenious at the time. Like, now it makes sense, but back then, obviously, it was a super genius thing. So he already proved his genius in Germany. So when he came to Japan, he was already primed with the credibility of successfully challenging assumptions underpinning doctrine or theory or whatever. So I spent all this time talking about how this amazing new aircraft, B-29, that was super up-armored and got all these fancy control systems and could carry all these bombs and whatnot. Curtis LeMay was like, well, I see all that fancy armor that we have. We're stripping all that out, which all the airmen were like, are you serious? You're going to get rid of all of our armor? But Curtis LeMay, his philosophy was like, okay, we need to end this war. The Japanese aren't going to submit willingly, so we need to do as much damage as we can to shorten the war, right? That was basically the theory of almost every single general during that time, because the Japanese famously, they wouldn't surrender. So the only way we can really get him to capitulate is just do maximum carnage, because in a weird, messed up way, that's actually going to save the most lives if we do the most damage. So he said, okay, obviously, we can only carry a certain amount of bombs on the B-29 because of the takeoff weight. But if we remove all the armor, unnecessary armor, we can put more bombs on. And obviously the airmen were like, you can't take all our armor. He's like, no, you're going to do that because we need more bombs. But to counteract that, we're going to fly at night, because the Japanese were famously known to be not good at fighting at night. Like their anti-aircraft and their fighters, their airmen, they just weren't effective at night. So we're going to go at night, and we're not going to have the advantage of the bomb site. But in order to counteract that, we're going to fly low altitude. And another reason why you want to do low altitude was in order to get up to the cruise ceiling of, I think it was like 30,000 feet. That takes a lot of gas, right? To get all the way up to station of like 30,000 feet, fly, drop the bombs, and then, obviously you come back, but whatever. But getting up to that high altitude takes up a ridiculous amount of fuel. So if you just go low altitude, well, you don't need that much fuel, which means two things. You can put more bombs on your aircraft, or you can have the same amount of aircraft, but you can fly from further back. And when you're talking about the Pacific Theater being islands, you don't have that many places to fly from. So range extension is a huge thing. And he understood this, even though all the theories and everything that was beaten into his head from the academics to application, and even the public or institutional pressure of the Army Air Force saying, yeah, high altitude daylight precision bombing is the way to go. He said, no, conditions are different. This is the way it is in the Pacific Theater, and this is what we're going to do. And rather than having all these conventional bombs that were effective against modern earthworks, the metal and the brick of Germany, they'd load up with fire bombs and napalm and phosphorus, or a whole bunch of things that were basically incendiary bombs that would just basically not do so much physical damage, but most of the damage would come from the fire damage. And of course, knowing that the Japanese buildings were basically wood-based, wood and paper-based, he knew that that would be more effective than just conventional anti-metal bombs. And sure enough, it worked. It's a devastating effects. Obviously, a lot of people today talk about the, quote, atrocities of the U.S. committed against the Japanese when looking at the firebombing that happened there, and also firebombing in Dresden. Some would even argue that the atomic bombs that we dropped were less destructive than the firebombing that was done on Tokyo and Dresden. So the fact that we even have this debate just shows you how effective the firebombing campaign was. And that all came about because Lemay went against conventional theory, because conventional theory was based on a different set of circumstances. And he realized that, okay, in this new battlefield, we have to redo our assumptions based on the conditions of the battlefield. And I won't say long story short. So long story long, this is a big part of the MSS studies at the Academy, talking about not only how air power theory came about, but also how we have to recognize not just the theory, but understand the assumptions behind every theory so that we can make our own assumptions and update the theories based on the conditions of the battlefield, because every battlefield is different. There's that whole famous saying that generals are always training to fight the last war, because whatever war we're fighting is going to be presumably different than the last war. But because the only thing that we know is the last war, everyone trains for the last war, even though that's not necessarily effective. So that's Curtis LeMay. What does it have to do with today? Finally getting into it. So the main point of this is to address the comments about what's going on in Turkey with the lira depreciation and the inflation and the economic troubles that Turkey is going through right now, where it's pretty much almost universally stated that Erdoğan, the president of Turkey, he's being an idiot and he's constantly lowering the interest rates, and that's what's causing all these problems. And if we just do what the conventional economics theory states, which is raise interest rates to stop inflation, then everything will be back to normal. Because according to conventional economics, if you have inflation, your economy is running too hot, so you have too much money chasing too few goods. That's the famous phrase. So what you want to do is the central bank of Turkey, it needs to raise interest rates. And if it raises interest rates, well, then what are people going to do? Well, with interest rates raised, that means the cost of borrowing is going to be expensive, which means people that would normally spend money would not spend money because buying things is going to be more expensive because the interest rate on any loans is going to be expensive. Because it's more expensive to borrow, they're going to borrow less, right? And borrowing presumably to spend into the economy. So because they're going to be borrowing less, they're going to be spending less, right? And also the other side of the coin for raising interest rates means the banks are going to be paying you more money for saving in your savings account, which encourages savings. So not only are you not spending money in the economy because it's too expensive to spend the money, but you're also going to save that money because the banks are going to pay you more money. Or I should say, because the banks are going to pay you more money, it's more advantageous for you to keep that money in the bank and not in the economy, which further cools down the economy. And that means since there's less money chasing the same amount of goods, well, then inflation will drop and then you're saved, right? That's pretty much anyone in high school or first year college economics class. This is like standard. And I'm not saying anything shocking or controversial here. And that's actually why everyone is basically calling Erdoğan an idiot, because any high school or college economics undergrad student is going to tell you if you have a high inflation, raise your interest rates, everything is good. So that's his thing. And of course, Erdoğan, he's like, no, I'm going to lower the interest rates because interest rates are bad and I know better. And if you lower the interest rates, that's going to bring Turkey back to prominence. And there's a lot of theories about there why he's thinking that, all the way from the crazy things from, okay, he's just going in his old age, he's becoming senile, or that, okay, well, this guy, he's not a secularist politician. The whole thing about Turkey, or should I say the Republic of Turkey, post 1923, is that it came out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. And the founder of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, said, okay, we're going to be a secular nation because that's the only way to bring Turkey from the backwards history of the Ottoman Empire days and remove religion as an influence in politics or within the state. And he was educated in Switzerland and also in France. So like Code Napoleon, laïcité. Laïcité is different than in America. In America, we have freedom of religion, whereas France or laïcité is freedom from religion. So that was this whole big thing. It's like, okay, it's not just religion or freedom of religion is not enough. We have to have freedom from religion. So completely divorce religion from the state. Anyway, we can devote a whole podcast on the ascent of Erdoğan. But essentially, as far as Westerners concerned, they considered him a moderate Islamist, which I can get into future reasons why that's an oxymoron in itself. But the point is, Erdoğan, the current president of Turkey, is an Islamist, right? He's big into religion. He's like what George Bush was to Christianity. So Erdoğan being a moderate Islamist, or just plain old Islamist, a lot of his theory of governance comes from his theories on religion, specifically his theories on Islamic religion. And one of the things that's said in the Quran is the outlawing of interest rates, of usury, right? Usury is forbidden, or it's haram. It's taboo in Islam. So Quran forbids charging interest. It forbids usury. It famously says Allah permits trade, but he does not permit interest. And charging interest is the way of the Satan. And whoever charges interest is going to burn forever in the fires of hell. And the thing is, what you're supposed to do is you're not supposed to take interest from people because that's consuming people's wealth unjustly. But instead, you're supposed to do is you're supposed to provide zakat. You're supposed to be charitable, right? And because zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And it was actually really further codified, if you will, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad during the reign of Abu Bakr. Actually, a lot of people say, oh, who's the most winningest general in all of human history? And people like talk about, oh, well, Napoleon, he was amazing, or Genghis Khan, or Alexander the Great. But actually, Abu Bakr, who was the first caliph or the successor to the Prophet Muhammad after his death. And this is actually the kind of the genesis, if you will, of the split between Sunnis and Shias. For those that don't know, is that after the Prophet Muhammad died, there was no clear line of succession, especially because he didn't have a male heir. So it's kind of like Game of Thrones-ish. I get nasty comments now because I'm comparing religion to Game of Thrones. Anyway, the two main successors to the Prophet were Abu Bakr, his father-in-law, and Ali, who was his son-in-law. And eventually Ali became the caliph, the fourth caliph, but there's a whole bunch of things which would require going to a history podcast at this point. But long story short is that who was going to be the successor, whether it was going to be Abu Bakr or Ali, was basically the initial cause of the schism, the split between Sunni and Shia Islam. But irrespective of all that, the fact remains Abu Bakr became the successor to Muhammad, and he started going on this massive campaign of conquering, I wouldn't say the known Arab world, but pretty damn near at least the entire Arabian Peninsula and a bunch of other places. And famously, he didn't lose a single war. So when a lot of people say, oh, who's the most winningest general, Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great or who have you, well, actually, it should be clear-cut case that Abu Bakr is probably the greatest or most winningest general in all of human history. And during all these wars of Abu Bakr, he basically said, okay, one of the pillars of Islam is zakat, where you have to give 2.5% of your income, of your wealth, to Allah, right? And because he was the caliph and it was a theocracy, that was essentially the tax or the charity that you would give to the state. And because the state was speaking directly on behalf of Allah. So from an economic standpoint, without getting too much into the religion, that's what basically he financed the empire, right? And it still stays to this day. One of the things that Muslims do or they're supposed to do is provide zakat. As Christians would call it, they're supposed to give tithe to their local mosque or whoever. And compare that as a Christian who's supposed to technically give 10%. Maybe that's more, higher percentage, but because hardly anyone does that, from an absolute standpoint, it's considerably less. So the obvious question would be, well, if interest is forbidden, how do all these Arab theocracies or Arab religious countries, how do they have a banking, how do they have a financial system if they can't charge interest? Well, they get around that by basically giving, quote, interest-free loans, but they get a stake in the enterprise that's asking the loan, which, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that amount stake corresponds to the interest that they would get had they been a Christian, Jewish, secular, whatever, financial institution. And nowadays, like if you go to like Dubai or Riyadh, a lot of these places where like they're trying to bring a lot of fintech startups, a lot of the big fintech startups in the Arab world is about how to do Sharia compliant fintech, because most fintech apps are all about you got to charge interest, right? That's how you make money. So this is a way you can still make money as a fintech startup, but you do it in a way that's Sharia compliant, where technically you're not charging interest. So it's all halal. It's not haram, right? But anyway, long story short, this shapes Erdoğan's view, because Turkey is obviously it's a secular country, or at least it's supposed to be. So its institutions, like especially its banking and economic sector, obviously interest is being charged. But Erdoğan detests interest, and if he could, he would eradicate it. But there's institutional inertia history there that he can't fully get rid of. But in his worldview, he's constantly trying to lower the interest rate because it's haram to him in his eyes. That's the story that most people will give you on that, on why he refuses to raise the interest rates, even though every classical economist under the sun will tell you, obviously, just raise interest rates and this thing will all be over. But the thing is this actually true? And one of the things I want to do with this podcast as we go forward is mix and match different things, whether it's politics, social issues, geopolitical issues, international diplomacy, economics, military warfare, obviously, but constantly do a rotation so it doesn't really get stale. But we're going to revisit a lot of things. And one of the things we're going to revisit, well, especially when we have episodes focused on economics, is about the flaws of classical economics. And here, I'm going to initially say, come on, don't bullshit me. Erdogan is bullshitting us with this lower interest rate. But I'm going to pause here and say, is he really bullshitting us? Because is the classical theory true that raising interest rates reduces inflation? And I'm going to try to take you in the mindset of Curtis Lemay. All institutional and historical inertia tells you to do high altitude precision bombing, right? This is the way it is. Germany is the battlefield where all military theories are tested, whether they're bullshit or not. It becomes readily apparent. Now you're Curtis Lemay and you're saying, okay, this is what everyone's telling me. Obviously, this is what history's telling me. This is what my rational brain is telling me. This is what to do. But I'm in a different area now. Should I still be doing this? And that's what I want to talk about here, is that classical economics, for the reasons that we stated, it's quite evident, it's clear cut. It totally makes sense. Raise interest rates, which means it discourages spending and encourages savings. And obviously, that should decrease inflation. That's not controversial. But we need to understand the theories and assumptions that underpin that chain of thought and see if that actually applies to Turkey, just like Lemay did with Japan, because the theories and assumptions in Germany did not necessarily apply to Japan. The assumption from classical economics comes from one of the big underpinnings of classical economics is, the quantitative theory of money. MV equals PQ, which is the amount of money you have, M times the velocity of money, how fast it exchanges hands, equals the price level times the quantity of goods that are in an economy. And of course, on average, all things being equal, V and Q are constant. So all that's left really is M and P. So if you increase M, if you increase the amount of money, your prices go up, right? And that's kind of like what inflation is, right? Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. That's the whole thing. But the thing there, and probably you've already guessed it by now, is that V and that Q are not actually constant in real life. It makes good for economics 101 and for neat little theories because the math is pretty straightforward. But that assumption of classical economics implies that the quantity of goods can't increase, which in macroeconomic standpoint means that you have full employment. Your labor force is completely being used to produce goods. In classical economics, we like to talk about comparative advantage, where they talk about, you're on an island and you have bananas and oranges, and your buddy's on another island and he has bananas and oranges. Your island is like bigger than his island, so you have potentially more trees than his island where he doesn't have enough space for enough trees. But the thing is, his climate is better for oranges, where your climate is better for bananas. So even though you can make more oranges than him, you let him completely focus on doing oranges and you completely focus on bananas. And comparative advantage states that even though you're not doing the thing that you're obviously better at than him, because he's doing it from a relative standpoint, he's completely focusing on that, the amount of bananas and oranges total between the two of you actually increases. That's the whole point of comparative advantage. And comparative advantage introduces the concept that trade is good. Free trade is good because it improves the real welfare, if you will, of all citizens, right? But again, the assumption here in that very basic example is that you're using your entire island for bananas and he's using his entire island for oranges. So there's no room to increase the capacity. And that's not a bad assumption, right? Actually, that's what we want to strive to, because if we have all this potential, we want to realize all the potential because then we become richer, right? So again, the fundamental assumptions behind classical economics is that you're using all your resources, which makes ideas like comparative advantage, they make sense. And again, that's a nice thing to have, because why wouldn't you want to realize all the potential of your land, right, of your society? If we're going back to the island example, why settle for growing 4 trees if your island can support 6 trees, right? Grow 6 trees to produce the max amount of produce. because everyone becomes richer for that. The land can support it, obviously do it. So the underpinning behind classical economics is that you can't increase your quantity of goods because you're using the max amount of goods available. It's a zero-sum game, which is why comparative advantage works, is that for every orange I produce, I can't produce X amount of bananas. So rather than waste my resources on oranges, let my friend whose island is better at producing oranges, let them use it, because zero-sum game, I'm losing that land for potential banana production, because with that land where I can only grow one orange tree, I can grow 2 banana trees, right? That's comparative advantage. But the thing is, again, using all your resources, while again, that's a very noble utopian concept of classical economics, frankly, that's not true in the real world. Because as much as we like it, we're not using all of our resources. I mean, frankly, using all our resources would be disastrous because there's no slack, not to mention economic conservation and all those other random things there. But just even if it was possible in some like Ayn Rand paradise where everything is being used by Acme Inc., we're not at that case. And you can easily point to this because the mere fact that we have unemployment or even underemployment means there are people not doing stuff, which means that's resources not being used, labor not being used, things are not being produced. And this is where classical economics breaks down. I'm not trying to say classical economics is wrong, or I should say, well, I mean, it is wrong, but I don't want to say classical economics is bad, because we should all aspire to a utopian society where classical economics is the reality. We're using all the things that God has given us, if you will, and we're not wasting anything, and we're producing the max amount of wealth for our society, for ourselves, and for our citizens. But it's just that we're not there, and we have to deal not with what we want, but as Donald Rumsfeld, may he rest in peace, would say, you don't fight with the army you want, you fight with the army you have. So we can't run economics based on theories that we want or that sound nice. We have to run economics based on situations on the ground, just like Lemay with Japan. And the point here is that unemployment is an issue. It's wasted resources. From a sociological, liberal peacenik standpoint, it's bad because obviously people don't have money and they're poor and everything like that. But from a pure, cold, calculated economic standpoint, it's also bad because you're not fully utilizing your resources, which means your Q is not maximum, your Q is not constant. So in that classical economics, the equation of exchange, the Q is the quantity of goods, goods and services, is not constant. It can move up and down. It can drop, which means more unemployment, or it can rise, which means less unemployment, right? And more stuff is being used. And we'll have other podcasts about this too. There's also a lot of things like why crypto coins are bullshit. I'm not talking about blockchain. There might be some uses for blockchain, but the actual cryptocurrencies, or even this whole abolishing the Fed, this libertarian paradise of, oh, we're just going to abolish the Fed and go back to the gold standard. They're all nice concepts in theory. Well, obviously they're good in theory because that's what theory is. Everything sounds nice in theory, but they're nice in theory, but in reality, they're just at best bad, at worst super malicious, because the world doesn't work like that. Because people think that money is exchanged like barter, like this is back during the American colonial days where you have beaver pelts and you're trading it with the Native Americans for some corn, right? Money is not like that. Money is not a medium of barter, it's credit. The economy, even though it's, well, simplistic obviously sounds good and it's easier to understand, it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. But from a simplistic viewpoint, people think, okay, money, it's like barter, right? I give you A and you give me B, and that A happens to be money, dollars, euros, yen, whatever. Or if it's gold standard, and a lot of libertarians they talk about, forget about the government, we should go back to gold standard and go back to barter. I give you gold pieces and you can give me, beaver pelts, right? But the thing is, that's not how economics works, or say, that's not how global economics works. Because while between you and some guy, it may appear like barter is working, but in reality, the exchange of goods and services, which is obviously the underpinning of all economics, that takes time. There's a time delay in all transactions. And for all the accountants that are listening, or anyone who's dealing with corporate finance, knows this, right? You have accounts receivable, accounts payable, and there's a difference between your income statement, which is the money that you're entitled to, and your free cash flow statements. Also, just in general, if you're an entrepreneur or in charge of a P&L, you know this. There's a delay between you spending money to acquire resources, whether it's humans, employees, or just working capital, and a time for that working capital to be put into use. And then eventually you produce the good and then sell it and then get the money. So there's a time between you spent money and the time that you receive money. That delay contributes to the time delay in exchange of, I would say, modern economics, but just even ancient economics in general. I want to do a podcast about this, about the actual nature of money, but I can't do this now because this will be another 2 hours and we're going to go into the Old Testament and a whole bunch of things in there. And you're like, what the hell does the Old Testament have to do with anything? Trust me, it has to do a lot, but I'm trying to keep myself grounded here so this doesn't become like another AUKUS podcast, like over an hour plus, which it probably will, but I don't know. My producer will tell me what the final count is. Anyway, so there's a time delay between money spent and money received. And in order for economics to work, there has to be, the financial sector is there to facilitate or to bridge the gap between that time delay. Because I can't just go to a worker who's been working and say, hey, look, as soon as our customer pays us for the products, let's just talk about the banana tree, right? As soon as the guy from Orangina land pays for my bananas, I'm going to ask you to work on this island and grow all the bananas. And you're going to do it for free. But I totally promise you that once the guys from Orange land pay me money, you're going to get that money for all the work that you did growing the bananas, right? It doesn't work like that. So what you need to do is go to the financial sector of your island. And the financial sector, what their job is to say, hey, look, we know you're good for the money because you obviously have contracts and you're established business. We're going to give you a short-term loan for like 30 days or whatever. And you're going to use that to pay for your workers, right? And then after you get your money from your consumer, then obviously then you pay us back plus interest. That's usually how it goes. And we're not even talking about long-term investments because obviously we can further complicate this talking about savings and investments. And this is actually one of the things that they're talking about with Erdoğan and the collapse of the lira is that in order to make investments, you actually have to save, but that's actually wrong. You don't save first to have investments. First, you make the decision to invest, and then you save that money. At least as a business, that's what you do. So it's not that you need savings to invest. It's just savings are the score sheet or the materialization of the ethereal decision to invest. So it's kind of like the accounting mark of investment. So you make the decision to invest first, then you save the money, and then when you can actually purchase whatever machine that you're going to do, you obviously pay it off from your savings. From a simplistic standpoint, you can say, oh no, that's stupid. You gotta save first and then you invest. But the point is, again, if you're going to a business or any financial venture, is that the decision to invest always comes first. And you either take time to accumulate savings or you take out a bank loan. And this, again, goes back to the whole point of the time delay of exchange. And in fact, you don't even have to take my word for it. You can go to the IMF or World Bank. There's tons of papers out there. And they talk about how the whole point of trade finance is this bridging of the time delay between credit and debit, this time delay of exchange. And trade economics, or just economics in general, is reliant on the short-term financing that bridges this time delay of exchange. And most business transactions, like I think it's like over 90% of global transactions take this form. The point is to bridge this gap, you need this financial sector because they bridge the gap. They allow the seller to borrow, in economic parlance terms, it's called working capital, to complete the order that they receive so that the purchase can happen. So this either happens through these short-term loans or credit insurance. But either way, again, over 90% of trade in the world falls under this category of this time delay of exchange, where the short-term credit is basically the fuel that drives the engine of international trade. And what does this have to do with barter and gold? Well, the thing is, even if it was, you had gold standard, and again, you had this libertarian paradise, well, okay, fine. Well, there's still this time delay of exchange where there's the time where you have to spend to extract the gold, right, to pay people or hire the workers to extract it for you. At that point, you don't have gold. You got to get the gold. And then after that, then you can start paying. But then you're saying, no, I'm already rich or whatever. I already have gold. Well, okay, fine. You already have the gold. But again, this is another shortcoming in classical economics, is that its theories are based on static systems that are frozen in time. So then, okay, you have this gold. You paid it in advance. You paid the workers for the bananas, but you're still waiting on the payment of the oranges. There's a time delay there. And oh, by the way, even after that exchange is complete, well, then the next season, you need to acquire gold again to pay the workers for the bananas and then get oranges again, and then so on and so forth, and repeats. So because we don't just do one economic exchange in our life and then drop dead, we do multiple things over hopefully a long, fortuitous life. The economics is dynamic theory. So even if you have an initial capital, say, you've been blessed with rich parents like Elon Musk, eventually there's going to be a point where you have to acquire capital before you can spend it and realize your economic gains that classical theory promises us. So that's why this time delay of exchange is important, and you just can't think of things as bartering. And again, 90% of global trade, and when you're actually talking about on the scale of sovereign nations, which obviously we're talking about that with the case of Erdoğan of Turkey, of a sovereign nation, I would say damn near 100% of global international transactions involve some form of either credit or some credit insurance or some sort of guarantee to facilitate the business transactions on a global scale. So, all right, why is this important? Because the thing is, just like with inflation, one of the assumptions in classical economics when it comes to theory is that there should not be persistent long-term trade imbalances. All trade should be equalized. And we know that's bullshit because America obviously persistently has trade deficit. Germany and China famously have trade surpluses. Greece that has trade deficits. Trade imbalances, whether it's a surplus or a deficit, are just the common fact of life. And there's no free market voodoo force out there pulling everything back to the center. And I'll explain why. But first, let's run through the classical theory. And to use an example to illustrate the classical theory, let's use USA and Germany. USA being an importer, obviously, and Germany being an exporter. And to further clarify this so that there's no confusion about euro, because it's not really Germany's currency, let's just talk about 1990s Germany, right? So we'll talk about the Deutsche Mark and the dollar, okay? To make things less confusing. All right, so if USA is buying all this stuff from Germany that Germany is exporting out, then that means obviously the United States or the world economy, Americans, are trying to sell all their dollars and buy all these Deutsche Marks so they can get all these German goods. And obviously, law of supply and demand, you're selling dollars, so the value of the dollars is going to go down, and you're buying Deutsche Marks, so the value of the Deutsche Marks are going to go up. Well, the more Germany exports and the more US imports from Germany, that the value of the Deutsche Mark is going to go up and up and up and up, and the dollar is going to go down and down, down, down. And all of a sudden, there's going to be a tipping point where all of a sudden now the goods in the United States, because the dollar is so low, it's going to become cheaper for Germans to buy from Americans and rather than just buying in Germany. And also, Americans are just gonna stop buying stuff from Germany because the Deutsche Mark is so valuable that it's gonna be too expensive. They're saying, well, I'm not gonna spend all my dollars converting it to Deutsche Mark because it's too expensive. I'm just gonna buy the stuff in the United States. So there's gonna be a shift, and now all of a sudden Germans are gonna start buying stuff from Americans. So they're gonna sell their Deutsche Marks, and they're gonna try to buy US dollars. And then the dollars are going to start going up, and then the Deutsche Mark is going to go back, and then until a flip, and then back to where we were originally. So there's this constant oscillation, but on average, long-term average, all trade should be balanced. That's what classical theory states. And in a barter economy where you're just buying and selling immediately when there's no time delay of trade, that makes sense. That's why it's called conventional economics, because it's conventional. This is what we all believe in. Most of us mostly believe in. But again, we can't ignore in the real world this time delay of exchange. And we don't just do bartering in international trade, because international trade is nothing without international finance. So it's not just that Americans want to buy stuff from Germany, so they're going to sell all their dollars and buy Deutsche Marks. But before we get even a chance for the Americans to sell their dollars and then buy the Deutsche Marks, because of the time delay in exchange, what has to happen is the Germans obviously need money first to pay their workers to actually produce the stuff that's being exported to the Americans. So the German financial system has to create a line of credit of Deutsche Marks, which increases the amount of Deutsche Marks in the economy. And then the German manufacturers use that line of credit to pay their workers, or either pay their workers or pay for the investment or the capital goods, whatever, to produce the stuff that's going to be exported to the Americans. And only then they give it to the Americans, and the Americans then sell their dollars and then buy Deutsche Marks to pay them. And of course, then the producer gets those Deutsche Marks and then pays back that line of credit to the financial bank. That's actually how it goes. So what classical economics states that, okay, the Deutsche Mark should be increasing because there's a higher demand for it. Well, actually, in order for trade to work, the overall amount of Deutsche Marks has to increase because, again, the bank, the financial institution that's extending that line of credit is increasing the number of Deutsche Marks in the system. So if there's more Deutsche Marks, well, obviously, as we know from, ironically, classical economics, then the more there is something, then the less value is. So that's going to drop down. And because there's a one-for-one exchange, meaning that the line of credit that's being created to produce the exports gets immediately wiped out. Well, or not immediately, but it gets wiped out after the trade has happened. When the American pays for the export, it goes away. So then the Deutsche Mark increases in value again. But that initial drop-off value from the line of credit is counterbalanced by the increase in value from the export. But the net effect is that the level of the Deutsche Mark compared to the dollar is the same, is static. So when we extend this to a broader standpoint, that explains why we have trade imbalances in the world, right? And that's why America consistently run deficits, and countries like Germany, China, or whatever have you, consistently run surpluses, because for every export, there has to be an additional increase of credit or an increase in monetary vehicles, monetary currency units to facilitate that trade to happen. And because that balances it out, that oscillation theory that we talked about in classical economics doesn't work. And that's precisely because of this time delay of exchange. So, what does this have to do with Turkey? Well, I was being a little cheeky there because the thing is, the credit is not a perfect one-for-one balance, because obviously, why would the bank do this? It's not like out of their own pure benevolence. They're good people and we'll totally give you credit and you do it. They're charging an interest, so they're making money. And because usually these type of trade financing is done under 30 days or what have you, it's a short-term horizon, so it falls under short-term rates. Well, what also is a short-term rate that we've been thinking about in the news? Oh, the interest rates of the Central Bank of Turkey or central banks of countries in general, right? Because the thing is, interest rates that the central bank set are essentially the floor, the price floor of the minimum interest that banks will charge. Because Obviously, they're not going to charge lower because why would they do that? The central bank is paying higher. So if the interest rate in the United States is, well, right now it's 0%, so that's a bad example. But okay, in Turkey, the interest rate is 15%. Then the cost for financing, again, financing is not something, oh, it's a nice to have. It's the essential, like we just talked about, it's the essential lifeblood of trade, is that for any financing that's going to occur to facilitate international trade with Turkey, the minimum cost of that is 15%. So by increasing the cost of financing for trade, because everyone keeps saying, oh yeah, increase the interest rates because that's going to reduce inflation. Just like there's an extension of credit to the exporter so they can build their goods and what have you, there's also a similar line of credit extended to the importer, to the Americans, so they can actually buy what they have to do, because on their side, they also have a time delay of money from whatever resources that they're doing within the United States. And of course, that position likewise gets closed out at the end of the exchange, so that the net result of the movement of currency or the valuation of the currency remains zero. So going back to our comparative advantage lesson, while comparative advantage is a very good thing to learn about in classical economics, because of this time value of credit, comparative advantage does not matter because it's not a zero-sum game. What matters is absolute advantage matters, because there can always be an expansion of Q, of the quantity of goods, or in financial aspects, there can always be an expansion of financial credit. So more money can always be created or more goods can be created. And because presumably with trade finance, that credit doesn't get expanded unless there's actually goods and services to be traded. So from a trade financing standpoint, inflation is not necessarily concerned because it only appears to facilitate the trade of the real goods and services that comes about. So that's the point here. And this is why these trade balances exist. So when we come back to Turkey, is that they're saying, oh, well, the currency devalued, that means the price of Turkish exports should be favorable. Never mind, there's the economic scene, which we'll get to, is different. There's not a healthy and robust economic infrastructure for Turkey to do a lot of exports and imports, because in order for Turkey to export, there has to be things that other countries want to buy, right? And also Turkey has to be able to produce it. But even assuming that that's the case, because of this extension of credit that we just explained to facilitate trade, you can readily see that raising interest rates will not help Turkey's situation. If anything, it will harm. I mean, Erdoğan, well, he's wrong. There are reasons why he's wrong, but at the cursory, the end result of actually lowering interest rates is actually a good thing. Raising interest rates is not the thing you want to do, because if right now, if the interest rates in Turkey are 15%, well, that's the cost of financing for the facilitating of trade in Turkey, right? So if you raise the interest rate, then the cost of financing trade, the cost of doing economics, the cost to play the game is going to increase. And you're saying, well, yeah, but that's good because you want to slow down the economy, right? You want to get a hold of inflation. That's the whole point. So that's why Erdogan's in the problem. But again, now you're falling into the classical economics assumption trap of that the economy is fully being utilized. And when it's being fully utilized, there's a zero-sum game. For every give, there's a take. But when you consider Turkey having double-digit unemployment, well, clearly the classical economics assumptions don't stand. There's always room for increase in productive capacity, so it's not a zero-sum game. So it's not a question of, oh, okay, all the resources are being used up in Turkey, so like the economy is doing so great, so we got to raise the interest rates and cool down the economy. The economy is already cold, so raising the interest rates, yeah, it's going to cool it down, but it's going to make things even worse. This is kind of like similar to what happened with the Volcker shock in the 1970s in the United States. We had the situation, inflation was high in the United States, and Volcker, the Fed chairman, well, before him, they were trying to raise the interest rates, but inflation was still going up. So he said, finally, screw it, I'm going to raise the interest rates to a ridiculous point, And sure enough, he finally did eventually get the inflation down. But in the process, unemployment shot through the roof and it completely destroyed the American economy. Fortunately, the United States is a pretty robust country so that we eventually rebounded. But if you ask the people back then in the labor force, was Volcker good? No, it was not. In fact, there were all these protests going on. If you remember back then, there's like news clippings where there were protests all over the United States, and like even farmers, for example, clogged up the streets of Washington, D.C. by putting their tractors and what have you, and heavy machinery in front of the Federal Reserve building as a protest because he just completely wrecked the United States economy. It's like, yeah, the economy slowed down, but it's like telling someone, oh, you need to lose weight, but rather than them going on exercise and dieting, they chop off their legs. It's like, okay, yeah, you reduced weight, but there's bigger problems there. So that's the thing. It's like, yes, you need to control inflation, but you can't do it at the expense of the economic health of your country. And the classical theory of raising interest rates will slow down the economy is absolutely correct, and I'm not knocking it at all, but it does it at the behest of reducing consumption and at the same point reducing production. Consumption, production going hand in hand there. So if your economy is already shit in the sense of employment, which obviously in Turkey unemployment is atrocious, raising interest rates to cool down the economy, well, the economy is already freaking cold. You don't want to go like absolute zero here. So that's the error that the people are making. So to Erdoğan's credit, well, I don't know if it's to his credit. I don't know if he's actually thinking this, because again, like we already talked about, his reasons are more having to do with his own religious economic theories. But besides the point, let's just steelman this. To his credit, he's kind of right. You don't want to raise the interest rates because inflation is not the end all be all. The economy, the well-being of your citizens is what matters. And to make this more precisely, to bring this argument home, if the economy is like a pizza, bear with me with the analogy here. It's not perfect, but food is not exactly economics. But okay, you have your base pizza, which is essential to have. I'm not talking about the bullshit Chicago deep dish style pizza. I'm talking about real pizza. I don't have to say New York style, Brooklyn style. It's freaking pizza. But anyway, so for real pizza, you got your dough, and then you got your sauce and your cheese, right? That's your absolute bare minimum for you to have. And then you could add other stuff on. You could put on freaking pepperoni, anchovies, not pineapples. Screw you. Pineapples is not a freaking topping. But anyway, put whatever the hell you want on it. And you can put all the freaking toppings on that you want. But at the base of it, you have to have your pizza pie, right? You have to have your base ingredients. Otherwise, it's no longer a pizza. So with classical economics, assuming slowing down the economy, there's a specific base amount of economic activity that has to happen in a country for the country to function. You have to have water. You have to have at least bread or some basic substance, some food, a cursory amount of electrical energy to keep the lights on. You have your base level of necessities, sanitation, whatever. These have to happen. These can't compromise on them because if not, then you have Somalia. Apologies to the Somalians listening. So everything else, all other economic activity, those are like the toppings on the pizza, right? You can have more, you can have less, and that can fluctuate. But the country will still move on. People will still live. And this is kind of like what people talk about, living wage versus a minimum wage. And people should be able to live. All the extra economic activity, industry, commerce, whatever, that goes on top of it, that's all good. And you can play around with that because the base level of living of your citizens is still going to progress. So this is the whole point of the distinction between developed nations, developing nations, and underdeveloped nations, and also dysfunctional nations. Depending on who you ask, whether underdeveloped or undeveloped, they don't have the base level of goods and services to provide for the general welfare of their citizens. Developing nations, generally speaking, have most of it, and they have some extra economic activity, whereas developed nations obviously have all that plus, all that in a bag of chips, and they have all the extra stuff. So you can play around with the economic output of the country and not affect the lifestyle or the quality of life of your citizens. So Turkey, obviously it's not a developed nation, but is considered to be a developing nation on the whole, where you have your customary goods and services, whether it's roads, energy, bread, water, etc. But obviously there is extra economic activity, but on a whole, it's not robust enough to carry on as the main engine of the Turkish economy. The reason why this is important is that while Americans or Europeans or what have you, Japanese, hell, even the Chinese to a certain effect, can mess around with the levers of their national economies, Turkey doesn't have that liberty, because with the assumption in classical economics being that, okay, the inflation is too high, so we need to slow down the economy. Well, if you're a developed economy, okay, yeah, you can afford to reduce your economic output because the quality of your life, the essential economy, if you will, the pizza crust of your economy, that part is still going. You're not reducing that part. With losing the weight analogy, you're not chopping off your leg, you're exercising, you're getting rid of your belly fat. But with Turkey, they don't have that. Businesses are underwater there, and trying to cool down the economy means that with developed nations, definitely, and in most cases, or in some cases with developing nations, you have a base level of economic activity that has to happen for a generally accepted quality of life for your citizens. It's called that X. So anything above X, you can play around with, and this is why classical economists say, hey, inflation is too high, raise your interest rates to slow down the economy. And that's with the assumption that there's a lot of stuff above X, so you can slide the scale up and down, still above that X level that's necessary for quality of life. And that slows down the economy, which brings inflation back under order. But with Turkey, there's not much above the X, and some would argue there's not even X for a lot of people in Turkey. Again, you got double-digit unemployment. That's not even considering the underemployment or the impoverished people who are technically employed but don't have enough money for their basic goods and services. And the population of their young people, that unemployment is even higher. I think it's like 46% or something ridiculous like that. It's just insane how their young people are not working. Their most productive age group is not even employed. So cooling down the economy, while from a cold, calculated economic standpoint, may definitely slow the economy. It's kind of like the Norton bomb site that was tested over the bombing ranges in Western U.S. Western U.S. bombing ranges is not 1943 Berlin, with the Luftwaffe and the anti-aircraft shooting at you. It's the real world and then the laboratory are completely different. And the same thing here with classical economic theory, and in this case, Turkey, a developing nation. So what this means to the shopkeepers is that they still have to produce their work. It's not like you're Facebook and you're like, oh my God, the Fed increased the interest rate, so now I can't sell that in too many ads until my economic output is lower. No, here in Turkey, you actually have bakers and butchers who are trying to bake bread and meat to satisfy people's dietary needs. And you're saying, oh, well, let's increase the interest rates and slow down the economy. Well, people still need bread today, and they're going to need bread tomorrow, and they need meat today, and they're going to need meat tomorrow. It's not like the economic output is going to decrease, because after a certain point, you got rid of all your belly fat. If you keep exercising and running a caloric deficit, your body's going to start metabolizing your muscles and then your organs, and then that's how starvation happens. So that's kind of like what's happening, or that's what people are essentially asking Turkey to do. And even if that were the case, it doesn't work, because they're not going to stop making bread. They're not going to stop making meat or whatever. And again, because of the time delay of trade, businesses are still going to be working, and inflation is already bad. Prices are already increasing. They barely are making ends meet. Increasing the interest rate means increasing the cost of financing, which we've already established is the lifeblood of facilitating trade in the first place, which means you're adding an extra artificial cost on an already overburdened economy, which means the baker now not only is barely making ends meet because the price of flour has skyrocketed, but on top of that, short-term financing that he needs to get to be able to sell the bread, buy the flour and sell the bread, that time delay, that financing from the bank, the loan is going to increase. So it's going to further burden him. And again, he doesn't have the option to not sell bread because this is his livelihood. He doesn't have savings, and people need bread. It's not like people are going to stop eating for the sake of the economy. Humans have real needs. So that's why, while classical theory is sound, I'm not saying classical theory is wrong. It's just the assumptions are only applicable to a specific narrow case. Again, think like Lemay. What's good for the bombing range is not necessarily good for Germany, and it's definitely not good for a bombing campaign in Japan. And the same thing, classical theory might work in the laboratory and may even work in some isolated cases with developed nations, but it doesn't work in a developing nation like Turkey, and specifically like with Turkey. And there's test cases of this where Argentina, for example, they've been constantly increasing their interest rate to slow down their economy. And what's happening is the inflation is still going up and up and up. Japan, on the contrary, they have deflation and they're trying to increase inflation. So again, conventional economic theory says, okay, lower interest rates to have inflation. And they're basically at zero. Well, they're at negative interest rates now, and they still have deflation. They haven't had inflation in almost 40 years now. So if we just get out of our American or Western bubble and see what other countries are doing, you can clearly see that classical economics doesn't work. And again, I'm not saying that classical economics is wrong. It's just, it's only correct in a very specific, isolated cases where you have full employment, you have the full use of your economic power or your economic utility, and also that you have zero time delay in your exchange of goods and services. So if we're going to raise the interest rates in Turkey, the baker is still going to continue baking bread and trying to sell it. But of course, now it's going to be even less of a profit or even at a loss. And companies, whether it's industrial or commercial companies, they still have to produce because people still need their wages. But their costs, their profits are already low as it is. It's going to be even lower, or even to the point where they can't handle, well, they'll actually just go under and then people lose their jobs. And in that case, well, okay, yeah, you do have less money chasing fewer goods, but not because you've in a healthy manner, reduced inflation by reducing the money supply. What you did was people have been laid off because companies can't afford to employ them, or even worse, companies just shut down altogether, which means no goods are being produced. And if no goods are being produced, well, then, yeah, sure. And then by definition, then demand is also zero, which means there's no inflation. So I guess, okay, congratulations, you solved inflation, but at what cost? Going back to the time delay of trade, well, another interesting anecdote or tidbit on this is that it's kind of funny that if you look back in history or in recent history, a lot of the financing that caused the prosperity, or that was the progenitor of the prosperity of Turkey, where people were talking about, oh, look, Turkey is the model developing nation, look at their economy and everything like that. A lot of that financing was around the 2008 timeframe. And when we're talking about long-term investing, the average time horizon for those type of debt instruments is usually 10 years. And when did the economy start going to shit in Turkey? Well, around 2018. And that's because what happens is when you have short-term financing, again, it's not like classical theory where it's a static one and done deal. There's a constant flow of trade going on, which means there's constantly credit being extended and being extinguished as trade flows back and forth. And another thing about this interest rate is that these companies get financed on these bonds. With long-term bonds, obviously you have higher interest rates. And the point is that, or the assumption that these companies are going to use these long-term bonds to make big investments, big capital investments or whatever, to grow their business. This is obviously standard. There's nothing controversial about that. And after their business grows, obviously they make more profit, more money, and they can pay back the loans that were granted to them 10 years later. But the thing is, what happens if the economy is not healthy, or if the loans were given in an unproductive manner, then those profits are not being realized. And I'm not saying like this is some sort of Ponzi scheme or something like that. A lot of times it just doesn't necessarily realize you can be exuberant in the loans or the risk calculations weren't done properly. The company's still viable, but they don't have the cash to completely service their debt. So what happens is, well, banks, they're not cold-hearted people, contrary to what a lot of left-wing people would say. But banks see this and say, okay, well, the bones of your company are sound. We're looking at in your balance sheets and your income statements. We see your financials are good. So what we're going to do is we're going to extend you more debt. So you basically take another loan out, which is used to pay off the original loan. And then now you have more credit so you can go do more stuff. And then you can, again, expand your business. And this revolving line of credit, a lot of companies, even in the United States and in Europe, this is just the standard thing. There's a revolving line of debt that you do. In fact, a lot of companies purposely take debt even when they don't need it. Google and Microsoft, Amazon, they're famous examples of this because you get actually tax breaks from the interest payments from bank loans that you wouldn't get from just raising capital from your equity. So the extension of credit and the rolling of credit, it's a constant thing in the economy. And raising interest rates means that 10 years ago, because the economic prospect landscape was optimistic, means the interest rates were lower. And if you're at this point where like, okay, your financials are good, but you don't have the free cash flow to service all your debt, getting a new loan that's now all of a sudden has a higher interest rate, when all of a sudden, your revolving line of credit, now the cost of that has increased, not because you're asking for more money, but because servicing that debt is now increased. So raising your interest rates when your economy is based on a revolving line of credit is also damaging. And not, yes, again, to the classical economists' credit, yes, you're going to absolutely slow down the economy, potentially slow down the inflation. But doing so in this particular case means the company goes under. This is exactly what happened with Lehman Brothers back in 2008 or whatever it was. It wasn't that Lehman Brothers was, sure that they've done shady things just like a lot of other banks, but that's besides the point. The point here is that the bones of their company were actually really sound. It's just that they had this liquidity squeeze. They didn't have the cash to be able to service whatever debts that they have, and they couldn't revolve the debt. Banks wouldn't lend them new lines of credit to keep going because they were over leveraged on the different things. And obviously there's tons of reports on this, but they famously went to the United States government to ask for a bailout when George W. Bush said no. And of course they went under and they failed, but their assets didn't fail because what happened was, like vultures to carrion, all the other big banks took all these amazing assets of Lehman Brothers and bought it pennies on the dollar and incorporated and improved their balance sheet. So it was good for them. It sucks for Lehman, but it was pretty good overall for the banking sector because the underlying assets of Lehman Brothers was good. It's just they were under a liquidity squeeze. And that's kind of essentially what's happening in Turkey now. Well, not essentially, because there's other issues about the bones of the economy not being good, which we'll get to. But when you have a liquidity squeeze, if you can't find debt, if you can't find people to lend you debt, then your company will go under. And in order to find debt, the riskier your company is, the more interest you have to pay. And if the central bank increases the interest rate, well, that means the floor, the starting position of that interest rate, which is going to go up, is only going to further increase the interest load that you have to find to be able to service your debt. And of course, if it's too high, then you're going to go under. Not because your company was bad, it's just that you couldn't get money to pay for immediate needs. Again, in 2008, when a lot of these lines of credit were being extended, the central bank interest rate was below 20%. And normally, like, who cares about what happened 10 years ago? Because most functioning, at least developed countries, have a sound economy. So the prospects and health of the companies are going to expand and only get better. But if they don't, well, then what happened 10 years ago matters with these revolving line of credits, because guess what happened in 2018? The central bank interest rate went above 20%. And that means the cost of revolving your debt is obviously it was higher. And if your company can't even service the principal or the original interest, a new loan obviously being more puts you even under a greater financial burden. Now, another factor of this that we need to consider is that unlike countries like United States, UK, Japan, where the credit that's being extended is in your own local currency to finance and facilitate the running of your ventures, the credit that was being extended to Turkish companies during this 2008 period of economic prosperity that Erdoğan was ushering in did not come from Turkey. It came from American and European lenders, which means that the debt that was being serviced was not a Turkish lira, it was a foreign currency, which exposes you to foreign currency risk. Because if you have a loan in a lira and inflation happens, well, actually, hell, that's freaking good because the loan that you took out was for, let's say, 1,000,000 liras. Now 1,000,000 liras today is now only worth, 100,000 liras. Well, I'll make that deal every single day. Inflation, this is the whole point of mortgages, right? Mortgages are an awesome thing, generally speaking, because to take an example, when you take out a mortgage, you take a mortgage for the value of the house now, but you pay it off in 30 years, and the value of the mortgage, which is constant, 30 years from now is worth considerably less because of inflation. When you were paying, let's say, $100,000 in today's money, $100,000 30 years from now is not going to be worth that much. So, hell, you're actually making money. Add that on top of the fact that the value of the house presumably is going up. You can see why housing is generally considered a good investment. But that only works because the value of the dollar has depreciated. You have inflation, and maybe healthy inflation, but inflation nonetheless. But the value of the dollar in the future is worth less than the value of the dollar today. And your loan being in dollars, that's what you pay, so you don't really care. That's what it is. But when it's a foreign denominated debt, your inflation is actually a problem because your loan, in the case of Turkey, the loan that the Turkish companies took out were in dollars or euros. So this is obviously wrong, but if the lira and the dollar is identical, and you take out $1,000,000 loan, okay, well, you got to make sure you have 1,000,000 lira, and you can plan your financial forecast that, okay, 10 years from now, when I have to pay back this loan, I have to give this U.S. debt collector $1,000,000. So, okay, that's equivalent to 1,000,000 liras. Boom, I'm good. Just budget 1,000,000 liras because obviously I work in liras, right? So now I'm good to go. But now with inflation, you still have to pay the $1,000,000, but now 1,000,000 liras doesn't give you $1,000,000. What you do now is you need 10,000,000 lira to give you $1,000,000. And you don't have that money because you didn't plan for that type of money. And what happens is, in the case of the central bank, or in case of the central government of Turkey, their debt that they were being serviced on, which was dollars and euros, well, they need to pay back these commitments, right? So the only way to do that was print more money, have more liras. And to an extreme case, this is what happened during the Weimar Republic in Germany, is that all their debt that they had to pay to the Allied powers, especially France and Britain, were all dominated in francs and sterling. The Germans had to pay this money to the French, reparations for World War I, but they weren't going to pay them in Deutsche Marks, they had to pay them in francs. And at the same time, the French took control of the Saarland, which was the industrial heartland of Germany, which means that Germany couldn't produce stuff because the French controlled it, so they didn't have the means to produce stuff to make their Deutsche Mark actually worth something. So the only way they can actually service the French franc debt was to print more Deutsche Marks to keep up with inflation. But of course, when you print more Deutsche Marks, then the value of Deutsche Mark goes down, and then it gets like a never-ending death spiral, and you had hyperinflation. And that's all because they didn't have the productive capacity to finance the foreign denominated debt. And to a certain point, that's what you have in Turkey, is that Turkey needs to service the debts that are maturing that they took back in 2008, 2010, 2012 timeframe, that they just went on a debt binge because everyone thought that Turkey was the darling developing nation. So foreign creditors were giving credit to Turkish companies and the Turkish government left and right. Now the chickens have come home to roost and say, okay, well, you need to pay back your debt. But because all that money wasn't put to good use, now you have inflation and they don't have the money to pay back on the open market. No one wants to buy the liras because the Turkish economy is shit. So in order to get the dollars, they have to spend more liras, obviously. And to do that from a foreign exchange standpoint, that's obviously inflation. And so what can the central bank do? Well, now if it takes 10 times more lira for a dollar, then you're going to print 10 times more lira to service those debts that you have to pay. And of course, by doing that, increasing the monetary supply, increasing the amount of liras, classical theory, where in case of M equals P, well, now more M means more P. So the price of the dollar increases, which means you have to pay more. So we're starting to get to the point where the initial cases of a potential death spiral. You can clearly see this in that most of the debt that was being offered during this heyday of this Turkish Renaissance was almost to the day 10 years ago, which is considered the average lifetime of typical long-term debt structures. And this is not some sort of out of the blue thing that happened. The value of the lira, just from general inflation and just the general aspects of being a developing nation, there was inflation. The lira was constantly losing value. It's just that it was considered acceptable and manageable. And assuming you have the bones of a healthy economy, well, the economic output that you produce should, in theory, counteract, and then some, the depreciation of your currency. But once the initial wave of these long-term debts began to mature in 2018, and you saw, yes, the lira was depreciating in value, but it really skyrocketed around the 2018 timeframe, which again, coincidence or not, you can make that choice yourself. But that's when the first volley of these debt instruments came to mature. So how could have this been avoided? And that is, well, if you have foreign debt, presumably you're taking that debt to produce things that foreigners would want. So that if I'm a Turkish company and I'm taking a euro debt, that's presumably to make an investment on something, to create something that I can sell back to the Europeans and they're going to give me euros. And then with those euros, I don't have to worry about currency risk. And I can use those euros to pay back the debt that was granted to me. And this comes back to international trade. If you're going to take foreign debt, you want to be able to make sure that you're exporting to that originating country or economic region, in the case of the euro, at least enough to service the debt of that currency denomination. So in the case of Turkey, you need to make sure that you're exporting enough stuff to United States and to Europe to acquire the US dollars and the euros to pay off US dollar and euro loans. But what do we know about Turkey with their trade? Well, they're not a net exporter, they're a net importer. So not only is the Turkish government and Turkish companies taking foreign debt, but they're also trying to acquire foreign currency to buy the things in Europe and the United States. So it's not like they're building up a reserve or a reservoir of dollars and euros to pay back their loans. Any dollars and euros that they're picking up, they're immediately using to buy goods and services from the United States and Europe. And that's obviously not a good thing. And the reason why this has been such a big poignant issue recently is that it's already bad enough that Turkey is a net importing nation, but you had this perfect storm of not only the maturation of these foreign denominated debts, but what happened in 2020? Well, the COVID pandemic hit, right? Well, there's a couple of things that happened. And specifically with Turkey, their biggest exports are heavy machinery, textiles, and tourism. Those are the big things. Now, what has happened recently in the international scene? Well, you had the Trump steel tariffs. And what did that do? Well, that obviously put a downward pressure on Turkish imports of heavy machinery. Not only their steel products, but also just the general industrial machinery derived from those steel products. They weren't able to export those. it didn't just affect Turkey. A lot of the steel exports that Turkey doesn't even go to the United States. I think it's only like 5% or something. But those tariffs, by the virtue of the United States economy, the United States being the United States, it affected the global worldwide price of steel, which had cascading effects that ultimately reduced Turkish industrial exports based on steel. Then with textiles and tourism, obviously they dropped during the COVID pandemic. Well, obviously tourism went to a complete standstill, so you're not getting that. Now, adding to the fact just general economic growth, usually if the sovereign country is financing its own debt with its own currency, it has reasonable power to keep the economic engine going. Say what you will. I mean, that's why like the whole joke about Mussolini is like, well, at least he had the trains to run on time. Is that dictators may be bad from a political or a social standpoint, but there's nothing saying that dictators are bad for the economy. If anything, because they don't have to deal with internal politics, they theoretically could be very good for the economy. And Erdoğan, yes, he was a strong man. It's not like foreign investors were stupid or naive. They knew he was a strong man, but with the message that Erdoğan was giving back during the early days of 2003 to 2008 timeframe was liberalization of the market and providing a lot of economic opportunities for foreign investors. And if you're an investor, would you rather get 0 to 1% interest on your investment in the United States, or would you rather get 20% in Turkey? Now, obviously, there's a risk because Turkey is riskier than the United States, but the risk premium that you're going to get, if it's large enough, you're like, yeah, why the hell not? And this was definitely the case last decade where economists all over the world were saying that Turkey is the darling developing nation and probably the safest developing nation to invest in. So you're getting ridiculously high. In the perspective of a developed nation, you're getting ridiculously high returns from a practically unrisky country. Now, what did Turkey do with this? Did they actually take that foreign debt from those foreign investors and actually do something productive from it? You can argue yes or no, but most people would argue no. All you have to look at is the GDP of Turkey over the past decade. But also notably, during this decade, you had things like the Gezi Park protests, you had this supposed failed coup, and a lot of other economic instability, him jailing his political rivals, which in Turkey's case, Turkey is kind of like the opposite of Russia in that whereas Putin is in with the oligarchy, well, yes, there's an oligarchy in Turkey, but they're against Erdoğan, or they were against Erdoğan. So whereas Putin, he works with his oligarchy to, if not improve the Russian people, at least improve the Russian Federation. Erdoğan actually actively fought against the Turkish oligarchy and put a lot of them to prison and whatnot. And was also, if the oligarchy is in prison, well, there's not much that's going to shake the confidence of foreign investors and the ability to extract financial returns from investments within Turkey. Again, you can have political instability in your country, again, going back to the Mussolini joke or anecdote, as long as you're controlling the financial instruments of credit. Because especially if you're the autocrat, you extend the credit based on your whim. But if other people, if foreigners are doing it, if they perceive the investment to be too risky based on whatever, but in this case, because of political risk, well, that's a big problem. And if the whole basis of running your country is predicated on the perceived unriskiness of the political climate of your country by foreign investors, well, doing politically risky things like jailing opposition leaders and businessmen and having these coups and whatnot doesn't exactly help investor confidence. And there's nothing saying that they have to invest in Turkey, so they'll take their money and their capital and invest in another developing country. And of course, once they do that, well then, not only do you have to increase your interest rates, just from a general classical economics theory, but you also have to increase your interest rates to attract the foreign capital in the first place. And of course, increasing the interest rates to attract foreign capital that has gone to other countries that puts even a further burden on your society, on your citizens. And then, of course, on the other side of the coin is it's not just about the exports, but it's about the trade imbalance, if you will, of the difference between exports and imports. And with Turkey, despite having an economy that's been mismanaged to the point of not producing real or stable or healthy growth, there has been a lot of economic activity, especially in agriculture and construction. But what does agriculture and construction rely on? Well, it requires energy consumption. With the price of energy going up, not only with COVID, but just in general, Erdogan's antagonizing of Russia. Well, Turkey is reliant on Russian natural gas, not only from a general energy consumption standpoint, but most of the fertilizer that Turkey relies on for their agricultural sector comes from natural gas that Russia provides. So an increase in the prices of natural gas or even a reduction of the flow of Russian natural gas not only increases the cost of energy, but by the fact of reducing energy means that it reduces your economic output, which means, again, another effect of not being able to service the debt that you have in foreign currencies because you're not producing enough. But even from a more broader perspective, one of the reasons why Turkey, despite being a developing nation, is almost paradoxically a net importing nation is because traditionally Turkey has always had high inflation, which again, high inflation in itself is not necessarily bad if it's managed, right? You just keep pumping in more money, and as long as people make more money than inflation, it's good. It's not ideal, but it's manageable. It's okay. But the thing is, what that causes from a psyche standpoint or a zeitgeist, as the Germans would say, is that the Turkish people as a whole generally have low savings, because why would you save your money if inflation is persistently high? Whatever money you have now, you should immediately spend it. And this is just a cultural thing. You go to Turkey, and then if you have a Turkish friend and you go to a restaurant, one way to egg them on is insist that you're going to pay. And then, of course, like everyone on the table is like, no, I'll pay. No, I'll pay. No, I'll pay. It's a big thing, and there's a big fight going on who's going to pay. And then eventually someone does. But the point here is that in the culture of Turkey is that wanting to pay for things or just not saving money is the general part of Turkish society. Conversely, for example, in Japan, it's the complete opposite, right? Japan has a chronic saving society. They constantly save money, which is one of the big factors in the deflationary troubles of Japan, is that everyone is saving, so the economy is not moving along. You're getting all the deflation, and with deflation meaning the yen is constantly gaining value, which encourages the Japanese to save even more, and then you got a death spiral in Japan's case, but you have a spiral nevertheless in the opposite direction. So with low savings, if you have low savings, that means you have low investments, right? According to classical economic theory, which means that you're not increasing the productive capacity of your country. Well, if you're not improving the productive capacity of your country, but presumably living standards are increasing or your population is increasing, which in Turkey's case definitely is the case, but population boom. Turkey had a huge population boom in the past 2 decades, means that Turkey needs more goods and services. But if there's no investments going on because of the lack of savings, then the only thing Turkey can do, or the Turkish people can do, is increase their imports to gain those goods and services. So trade imbalance that you already have that predisposes Turkey to importing because of the cultural or societal norms of not saving because of this ethereal spirit of inflation. It only exacerbates that trade imbalance to make Turkey even more of a net importer, which again, there's nothing wrong with that, provided that your economy can handle the importing. And in the case of foreign denominated debt, you can have enough exports to counteract that drain of currency. So yes, Erdoğan is a autocrat, but he was also a populist. That's how he got into office in the first place. One of the things that he said was that the current political climate, or back then, the current political climate was just the same thing here in the West. It's the right-wing politics, but whatever, that's not good or bad necessarily. It's basically saying In some cases, rightfully so, or in a lot of cases, rightfully so. The Turkish political elite were only servicing the elite, and the common man was being left on the wayside. So in this populist wave of support that Erdoğan got, one of the things that he wanted to do was improve the lifestyle of the average Turkish citizen. So he needed to make a lot of investments. And with all the economic liberalization policies that Erdoğan introduced during his first couple of years as, well, back then prime minister, he attracted a lot of foreign investment. And of course, if you're trying to rapidly grow your foreign investment, you'll gladly take it. But of course, foreign investment does have a specific risk if it's not serviced properly. And with the perception of foreign investors that Turkey is not only a safe country, but a model developing nation, well, of course, it's going to be flooded with financial investments. And the more financial investments being flooded, obviously the interest rates of those investments are going to be low. So essentially, even though the risk premium of a supposed developing nation should be at a specific high level, the amount of foreign investment that was flooding into Turkey meant that it was actually cheaper than the quote market rates of a developing country. So why wouldn't you take it? Okay, well, we just explained why classical theory doesn't apply here based on the Curtis Lemay effect. So you're probably thinking, okay, well, let's close up shop. We got it. Erdoğan clearly is right, and he should lower interest rates. I mean, we just spent, I don't know how long, but we talked about all the underlying conditions, why he should be lowering the interest rate. It makes more sense. Well, actually, despite everything that I just said, I agree with the classical economists. He should be raising the interest rates. And I'll tell you why in part 2. So stay tuned for the thrilling conclusion of this episode. If you would like to comment on this podcast or on the topics covered within it, or you'd like us to raise a new topic in our next episode, please feel free to leave us a message or voicemail on www.codbsm.com. That's Charlie Oscar Delta, Bravo Sierra Mike.com. Thank you for listening, and see you at the potty, Richter.